Hello and welcome back to the Joyful Catholic Leaders Show, where you'll hear stories and insights from those who lead with faith. From the seminary to the parish to the classroom to the office to the sports field and everywhere in between. Today, we are honored and privileged to be joined by Paul Ruff, Director of Counseling Services at the Saint Paul Seminary here in Saint Paul, Minnesota.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Privileged to be here. And,
we appreciate it.
Part of that role, too, is I'm Assistant Director of Human Formation, and those two roles play into each other quite nicely.
Absolutely. So how many different business cards do you have to put together to talk through all the different hats you wear?
Do we still do business cards?
I don't think so. It is 2021, so very good. So yes, Director of Counseling Services and Assistant Director of Human Formation. Just a quick bio on Paul. He's a MA level licensed psychologist here in the state of Minnesota for better part of 3 decades. He's been with the seminary 7 years and seen and done a lot in that time, and we'll talk about that today. Before that, he was in private practice for over 20 years. That includes some time in doing government counseling in Alaska on Kodiak Island. So November weather as we're recording today in Minnesota is, tropical for you after that experience.
Well, actually, Kodiak, Alaska in the winter is warmer than here.
That makes sense.
By quite a bit, because it's got sort of the maritime climate there.
I believe that.
Yeah.
I believe that. Worked in day treatment as well, just a variety of venues. Born in the Twin Cities and raised in Fargo, so a true Northlander, one of 7. And you told me off air, everyone in your family is either in journalism or counseling.
Right.
Which is kind of interesting.
And related to church work, about 4 of us as well.
Well, that's fantastic.
So we all like the story, and we're all drawn to matters of faith.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, that's a great segue into what we're going to be talking about today, and we really do appreciate the time, Paul. So to start, maybe just go a little more into your responsibilities as a counselor at the seminary.
Okay.
It may even surprise people that there are full-time counselors in the seminary setting. So tell us a little more about that.
Sure. And my role was really new 7 years ago, and I started part-time. And actually, it was kind of a mutual approach of each other, the seminary and myself, during the time where really the church was going through a lot of the crisis and coming out the other side.
Sure.
And it was really in my own spiritual direction, my own discernment, put my heart to sort of offer this as a possibility. And it fit, I think, well with what they were seeing as a need. So it's a new role. And when I was first hired, I said, let's not have a job description because we don't know what it should be yet. And Monsignor Callahan at the time was very amenable to that. So it's a job that has evolved, and I think pretty organically with the way we've been able to discern the needs and the resources that I can provide.
Sure.
And then after a year, we really realized there was enough room for full-time work, and now we're even expanding that vision a little bit more as we work to provide more counseling services to priests and supportive services in those domains as well.
Awesome.
So we'll be expanding staff a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, for a while it was just you, and you've kind of got a team working with you now
We've got
to help them in through.
3 contracted counselors now, 1 day each, who are making really important contributions, especially as we've had an influx of more men.
Yeah.
It's a big increase in numbers of new people coming in this year with the 43 guys we had.
Sure. Huge part of formation, as we like to call it, in the seminary world. Just at a high level, Paul, why is it so important for seminarians to focus on their mental health in this way? And
maybe I'll give a little bit of sort of arc of sort of how mental health things are included in the discernment process as well as in the preparation process of human formation. For many, many years, for decades now, and I used to do some of them, there's been a psychological assessment process for any man who's come
into the seminary.
And so before I was in-house, I used to do those. Now that I'm in-house, I don't do those. We've got other fine people doing them. So we've always wanted to make sure the church believes that the spiritual builds on the human, and that we've got a good foundation inside the man. Not that he has to be flawless or doesn't have some issues he's bringing in, but they have to not be grave impediments to being able to really partake freely in a formation process. He has to be able to make himself available in that way. So we really do a lot of vetting of the men through Father Bloom and his fine work in the vocation office. For a man even to get advanced for recommendation to us, he's gone through quite a number of steps, including a very intensive psychological assessment that looks at his developmental history, sexual history, general psychological testing parameters around intelligence, and looking for any possible pathology. And then we meet as a team to admit the man. often on admission, we'd say, this guy makes the cut. He can definitely use a formation program and contribute as a member of a formation community in positive ways. But here's a couple of flagged areas. Maybe some family of origin issues where there are particular upsets in the developmental history around divorce, or around a parent who maybe had some particular struggles with mental health themselves or alcohol. So there may be those pieces. And then the messiness of just being a person who develops as a young person in our culture. How have they made sense out of themselves and their life up to now? And where do they might need a little bit of support in that? Issues around anxiety are quite common.
Yeah.
We have a group now that is really for people learning how to manage anxiety in more effective ways. Some issues around depression, and then some issues around interpersonal capacities. Can this person really be a bridge and not an obstacle? And what parts of him, none of us are completely pure bridges in bringing people to Christ, but what parts of the man might be strengthened or fortified or healed through some counseling, as well as all the very, very essential spiritual and communal formation work that we do with men. It's become more common in seminaries now, and I think will become increasingly common to have a psychologist. I think there was a time in the church back in the 70s and 80s where the church stepped aside and let the psychological be too predominant.
Sure.
Then I think there was a pushback, and rightly so, against that the psychologist should never be the last voice about a man's discernment. But he can be an interesting and helpful voice in terms of helping people understand the capacities the man has and doesn't have. So I think we're brought in as a support to the other formation that's going on. And the intellectual formation, the spiritual formation, the pastoral formation are every bit as much and more in the forefront. I'd say we're more working on the foundation of being able to help a man with some remedial areas of development and growth.
Sure. You mentioned the psychological assessment. This may be more of an operational question, but are those pretty standard from diocese to diocese? So at the Saint Paul Seminary or St. John Vianney College Seminary in town here, even you've got double-digit different dioceses sending. So is there some differences from diocese to
There
diocese?
are some differences, and there's differences in terms of availability for a testing psychologist and assessment psychologist.
Sure.
And there's differences about what tools are used in different areas.
Sure.
So we do have a standard protocol that we send out and a standard assessment mock-up that we've given, redacted from any names of this is what the product should look like, this is what we're looking for. So everyone knows what we're looking for. Everybody knows our preferred instruments. Not everyone's able to comply with every piece of that. Sometimes when a man comes in, we say, we still need to do this piece.
Sure.
The Rorschach we found nationally, by national standards, is an important piece. A lot of places don't have those capacities. So we will often refer a man to complete that after he's here, if we see reason that could answer some questions for us.
Sure. Okay. Awesome. So that's sort of up front. How about once guys are in the seminary? What should they be focusing on? What resources are available to them? And how does the mental health piece of it work during this very formative time, and what should set the stage for their priesthood, God willing?
Yes. One process that we've started the last couple of years, the man has done all this investment in a psychological workup. And now psychological workups aren't magic x-rays of a person's capacities, but they do give some information. And often the man went through at a time where he was looking to hear, did I make the cut or not?
Right.
And wasn't able to take in the nuances of that. So dioceses have invested in that instrument. The man's invested his time. So I sit down, or one of our other therapists sits down, one of our other counselors sits down with the man, reviews the psychological assessment, and says, do you understand this? What parts do you agree with, disagree with? And then what does this tell you about what some targets for your formational work might be? And then we help the man convey that to his formator, the person who oversees his, what we call the external formation at the seminary. Those have been very helpful meetings, I think, both for the men to start to get a sense of reflectively how to think about their growth. Not am I okay or not, but what are the areas of growth that I could target? What further assessment, what might we need? There's a couple of men with specific learning disabilities we're discovering that really haven't been as fully assessed as they need to be. So we're looking at how do we target services for men who are intellectually very capable but have been handcuffed by that. For other men, there might be issues around family of origin issues that they really want to spend some time with the counselor unraveling. I have been very moved and edified by the lack of stigma for taking part in counseling at our seminary. I think this younger cohort, this generation, is generally more open to the possibility, and we never want it to be driving the process.
Yeah.
But I think they really are willing to avail themselves and come forward quite transparently. So most of the men at the seminary come in to see one of us, and it could be once, it could be many times. But really with specific purposes of what are the impediments that I need to get out of the way so I can be that bridge, so I can be the joyful Catholic leader instead of a man who's kind of struggling under some burden that really deserves to be resolved and the man deserves more freedom from.
Sure.
And men have done very, very edifying work in counseling.
Yeah. It's, as a layperson, it's interesting to see that, we hear about things like Priesty shortage, and you mentioned Father Bloom, who's the director of vocations in the Twin Cities, and he joked with me one time. He said, "I hate the poster, but I love the poster." The poster with all different seminarians on it, because as a church, we want good holy priests, and we know that we need more of them.
Right.
At the same time, what you're describing sounds like it's not just this commoditization of a person where you bring them through the door and check all the boxes and push them through. You're investing in them just as much as you're investing in the people that they're going to, God willing, be serving someday.
That's right. And the man really needs to be able to be a primary agent in his formation.
Yeah.
So he needs to develop a good deal of self-knowledge. And our, St. Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Avila are all about men and women need to keep working on how do I know myself, not so I can aggrandize myself, but so I can know what parts of me need deeper healing by the Lord and deeper healing humanly.
Sure.
So I think we're really there to help the man become the man he's called to be, not the man we hope he turns into.
Yeah.
And sometimes that would lead to a man discerning out of the seminary. And I think we've really learned as a seminary to not balk at that or discourage it, but to really greet that with freedom. The Holy Spirit and the man have to be the principal discerners, and then the church has to discern alongside about them.
Yeah.
We want to support that freedom.
Sure. Amazing. Okay, so a man goes through the seminary, he gets ordained, and then what? Because that really is just the beginning. And you mentioned the culture, you mentioned the world, you mentioned where the church is at.
Yes.
I would imagine most people listening to this or watching us on YouTube, understand that it's a challenging profession, to say the least. So what can we do for these men? What can they do for themselves from a mental health standpoint moving forward, post-ordination?
Right. I used to see a number of priests in my private practice and seminarians, which is part of what drew me towards the seminary. I was struck by what fine men they are and how much they have to carry.
Right.
And often how privately they try to carry things. So I think there's a need in the presbyterate that I think they're truly trying to address is how do we build our presbyteral support, our fraternity of priests to support each other? And then how do we seek the resources that we need as well? The new Ratio, the gift of priestly vocation, which came out in 2016.
Yeah, something like that. So for those who don't know, it's basically just
it's a document that really suggests
lays out formation.
How formation should happen. Yeah. And both the theology, the philosophy of it, and then sort of the working nuts and bolts of it.
Sure.
But one thing they're very clear about in that is formation for all of us as Catholics, for all of us as human beings, is an ongoing process.
No doubt.
We don't become adult and then we're done at some point. So we really want to be supporting priests who often are burdened with a great deal of responsibility quite early in their priesthood, since we do have a shortage of priests relatively currently. So they're carrying a big weight. They're in a society that doesn't necessarily support them as well. And thank God for the end of clericalism, but we also need to have a man feel loved and cared about in a community. And that's not as predictable an event.
Right.
And I think the tensions that men carry are often pretty profound. And if they have underlying things that still need some shoring up for them personally, humanly, those are going to pop up as they try to apply themselves. So I have a number of priests who have come back and said, can I see you at the seminary? And the seminary has been very generous that way. And I think we're now looking at through some I won't go into the grant cycle of things, but we're looking at some funding sources that really agree, and we've done a national study of this, there's a huge need for these priests to have good availability for mental health services that understand them in their priestly role.
Sure.
And knows how to support that in that way. And I've found that the seminary is a friendly environment for a number of men to come back to.
Yeah, that's good to hear. There is a vehicle for that, at least at the Saint Paul Seminary, with the Institute for Ongoing Clergy Formation, too. So
That's right.
It's built in structurally, which is awesome. So you mentioned the stigma. That's really encouraging to hear that at least the younger folks, are maybe more open about talking about mental health. But whether it's seminarians or priests, we're talking about guys here, and there can be that sort of shying away or hesitancy to be vulnerable in that way. How do you cut through that?
Yeah, this is something I do teaching on I do the Theology 1 Human Formation Integrative Seminar to really try to build a formational community. And sometimes men will say things like, I don't like to be vulnerable, as if this would be a human option.
Right. Right.
As if there's vulnerable
just like
people.
I don't like lettuce or vegetables.
Well, or as if there's vulnerable people and invulnerable people.
Right.
I mean, we're all vulnerable. So part of what we've learned to embrace, I think, as a community is vulnerability is really the place of encounter with the Lord.
Yeah.
It's the place of encounter with self and with other people. And it's going to be the leading edge of our growth. So we really, I think, have reframed vulnerability as an act of manly courage to step into the challenge and the call for growth. And I think men really support that with each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. In the Propagandic Year, we do a couple of interpersonal growth groups with the men, and they've just loved the chance to be able to know each other in a little deeper way, and even have said things like, that guy used to bug me, but now that I know he's working on it and understands this about himself and needs support, I have a very different way I get to relate to what's going on there.
Sure.
So I think the need to be known, and that you can't be approved for ordination without being deeply known. You can't be deeply known without being vulnerable and transparent with yourself and others.
Yeah, it's just kind of part of the deal, like you talked about it being foundational. I'm glad you mentioned the Propagandic Year, too. That's something that's relatively new to the seminary world. Talk a little more about that and maybe the mental health or human formation piece of that, which is really what it's all about at the end of the day.
Yeah. The Propagandic Year is the preparatory year. It's the fancy Greek word for that the new church documents have called for.
Yeah, I'm still learning how to spell it.
Yes, I got it finally.
Did you?
It's got
Good
it's got lots of vowels.
Get some trips from you. Lots of vowels. Yep.
Yeah. So the year has been very graced. Men are on a media fast there. There's no internet, no phones, and they love that.
Yeah.
In fact, they had to get their phones back for some COVID testing, and they hated it. They were so glad to get rid of them again.
Yeah.
So they've got a very strong community there, and really they're working to grow as brothers in fraternity and discernment. I'm there 2 days a week with one of the other psychologists one of those days. Once I'm teaching topics in human formation and leading kind of integrative discussion. The other days there's a process group that we're running, kind of interpersonal growth group. Jeff Cavins is there to teach the scriptural piece of things. Dr. Bill Stevenson is doing a very integrative piece on developing a Catholic intellect. And Father John Vanderplug really spearheading the piece on the spiritual dimension of growth. So I've been very, very struck by the grace of the program. Wish we would have had it many years ago.
Sure.
It's really, I think at a time where our culture leans so much against sort of clear Christian values and into sort of a relativism, there's really a need for a man to be able to come in and reflect on his life more deeply and reflect on it in the light of truth in the church in a way that helps develop more sense of self, compassion for self, understanding of the needs of his society, healing in some areas that need healing.
So beautiful. I'm sure we'll talk more about the Propagandic Year on this show in future episodes. It's like I said, kind of a new thing within the past half decade or so within the church, and the first year that the St. Paul Seminary is doing this.
Yeah,
so.
and I'd say we're on the leading edge of that happening
no doubt.
across the country. There have been some that have been doing it many years, but not many are doing it yet in a really thorough way.
So one more thing the church is doing to have good, strong, happy, holy, healthy priests.
Right.
So, on that same line, is it safe to say the emphasis that is put on mental health, both coming into the seminary, during seminary formation, and then after, is or can be a direct remedy for clergy abuse scandals, some of these different issues we've seen in the church in recent years?
It really was part of my draw towards the church, is to say there's something really being missed.
Sure.
something will always get missed. I mean, we're never going to get this perfectly. But I think there used to be kind of a thought by men going through the seminary, keep your head down. If you don't create problems, you'll get through, and then you get to be a priest. And I think we've really tilted it the other direction. Keep your head up. Let yourself be deeply known. And the man who we don't deeply know is actually the one we get concerned about. And the one we deeply know, we may have concerns about some things we know, and there's times we've helped a man discern to step out. But if a man thinks he's going to get through by just keeping covered, we really want that to become really an anomaly enough that we get concerned about it and that we don't have sort of an underground man getting through, performing well academically, checking the boxes, but not really availing himself in transparent ways of growth and revealing himself in transparent ways in formation meetings, possibly counseling, certainly spiritual direction. So I think that will help us have a better sense, a better feel for who is this man and what are his capacities.
Sure.
Now, could a man still stay hidden and be devious about things? Are possible, huh?
Yeah.
I just think they get much less likely when we tilt it in that direction. There's much more light coming into things.
Sure. 'Cause I think when we hear about these scandals, a big question, after the shock is just, why or how did this happen?
Right.
Is it as simple as if guys aren't fully known and don't know themselves well enough that they'll turn to different vices to kind of cope through the stresses of the priesthood? I mean, there's a lot of layers to this.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that.
On it, but how does it come together?
Most people got through the other way of being formed,
yeah,
and did pretty well, and there were really good things they got from formation.
No doubt.
I'm saying for the man who's trying to sort of sneak through in a more hidden way, that's where I think the danger is for a person. And I missed the first part of your question you asked me.
Yeah, just like the why and the how of how these things can happen. I mean, we're addressing that now, but where does that come from?
I would say
it's hard for people to understand.
That's right. I'd say the why usually is quite traceable.
Yeah.
Now, people who have been abused or been through really traumatic family situations, most of them would never abuse anybody.
Yeah.
But if people who abuse people, more likely they are to have gone through that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
People flip that around sometimes. Like, well, if you're abused, you'll abuse people. No,
right.
Very not likely. But certainly it's a red flag.
Sure.
So in the assessment process and all the way through formation, we try to look for those red flags and see if a man can be transparent and do healing in those areas. And if he can't, help him step away.
Sure. Awesome. Thanks for addressing that. As a member of the church who works for the church,
yes.
It's very edifying to be. We know all the problems, right? But
right.
to be part of the solution is awesome. So, some practical ways that priests and seminarians can take care of their mental health. You said a lot of it's on them. What are some things that you teach them to kind of carry out in their everyday life?
One thing that men are often poorly equipped with, and I spend a couple of weeks on this in the integrative seminar, is what to do with an emotion. And they often think of emotions as something they have to, just sort of tough their way through. And part of what I help men learn is emotions are a deep kind of information. They don't tell you what you should do, but they tell you where your heart is inclined.
Sure.
And you better learn to pay attention to your emotional life. So as they do that, they're able to, I think, avail themselves of being supported in places that are confusing, frightening, anxious, scared, or able to celebrate the delights of life in a fuller way. So I think taking care of our emotional hygiene is a hugely important part of general mental health. And I think men are starting to do that more in their own fraternal groups here.
Sure.
I had a priest once who said to me, please teach these men how to do a group fraternally, because we don't know how to do it very well out there yet. And so it is something we're looking at supporting also externally, both in the deaneries and in fraternal groups. How do we help those become a more deeply caring and knowing place as men work to keep growing as the men they need to be as priests?
That's awesome.
Exercise is one of the silver bullets of the emotional life. Being able to have physical activity, being able to have an enjoyable fraternity, having ways to actually recreate that are renewing are very important. Managing and regulating diet and sleep. this very rudimentary thing, we can be into our 60s and say, I still don't know how to put me to bed that well.
Right.
So I think there is a learning sort of how do I learn a regularization of life and routine that really does support my capacity then to manage stress that I'm going through.
Sure.
And then how to help them face and get support when they need it. Maybe dealing with a parishioner who's going through something that's out of their league. Who do they call? Can they freely consult? Can they freely say, I don't know what I'm doing in this situation? Which, as men, we don't readily stop and ask for directions.
Yeah.
No. So our wives remind us too, but they don't have a wife to remind them.
Correct.
They don't have a wife to remind them, you really should get to the doctor for that.
Right.
And so they need to start to learn how to pay attention in a different way and have brothers who can assist with that as well.
Yeah. And a lot of that does sound like pretty good advice for any Catholic.
Yes.
Any other things that you recommend the Catholics in general do to sort of tie
the other central
together?
part I always look at with priests is how is your prayer life and do you have a spiritual director? And if those things are not happening, that to me is an automatic red flag.
Yeah.
Not that this person is going to do something terrible, but he's not taking care of himself as a priest. That's foundational. A regularized prayer life, an intimate life with the Lord that he loves, and a spiritual direction life where he's being very transparent. I think as much as we can do that in our lay life as well, crucially important. We can't probably dedicate as much time as a priest is being called to. But I think there's very, very good mental health research on the value of prayer in maintaining resiliency in the face of stress.
Yeah.
So, and actually leading to better health outcomes for people.
Sure.
So I think all the other things apply to us as laity, but I would make sure want to underline that one for us.
Yeah. That's amazing. We're talking about a lot of, big, deep topics that, again, we could probably expand upon over the course of hours, and I'm sure we'll talk more in subsequent episodes, but appreciate you just kind of breaking it all down in ways that are pretty simple to understand. It definitely, takes a gift to do that. I'm going to throw one more at you and then get you out of here. And this is a little more macro level too, but we keep hearing about, especially in 2021, just sort of this mental health crisis or mental health epidemic that's plaguing our country in the United States and really the rest of the world. So it's kind of a two-parter, Paul. What do you think is maybe contributing to that, some common threads contributing, and then what role does the church maybe have to play in, fighting through what we're all, I guess, in some level dealing with right now?
Yeah, finding its way to sort of discern its way through it. I think there's such a breakdown in social fabric. Family structures have broken down, sort of the mores of life that maybe at times have been felt like burdens to people, but also are really part of a fundamental freedom to say, this is what my people do, this is how we manage, these are our ways of being resilient as a culture and staying on track. I think those are up for grabs. And as soon as you do that, the field is too wide open for confusing, sort of disparate ways to go. You don't have a culture that's carrying itself and transmitting itself in useful ways. So I think there's that piece. The internet, I think, is huge in terms of it leads to a lot of us spending too much time disconnected from face-to-face contact, which we know is vitally important to feed the psyche and the soul.
We have all kinds of data on how you need that by this stage in the game, right? Yeah.
That's right. We need that. And also these other devices, there's a book that came out recently called Dopamine Nation. Yeah. These other devices are naturally addictive because they have a reward system built in, similar to gambling. So we're learning to sort of fall for cheap rewards and not go into the depth of things. So I think that robs the psyche of the nutrition that it needs and the soul of the nutrition that it needs.
Sure.
And then I think just the negative news cycle that we have, where news is available 24/7, and really the things that we hear do come in, and even if we have a discerning mind, the preponderance of things pushing in on the psyche about disasters and crises, especially if we have a compulsive need to track them, really wears the psyche out. It's not supposed to know all of that all the time.
Right.
It's supposed to have discerning ways to pay attention. And I think those filters that would be just accomplished by time and distance naturally have all been breached.
Wow.
For good in some ways, because we can build new community, but I think there's a flood of things happening to us that we're still trying to swim our way through. And I think more choices puts more pressure on the psyche.
Sure.
30 brands of toothpaste creates distress.
No doubt.
Yeah. I loved living in Kodiak, where if you needed a shirt, you went to the shirt store.
Right.
Now I have to get online and look at this and compare it to that. We're burdened by choice, and we're burdened by the idea that we're supposed to be happy, which I think leads to lots of anxiety and depression for people.
Sure.
And that happy in this sort of commodifiable way is just not the way we should be looking at meaning of life.
Sure. And then what role does the church have to play to
Well, I think
this?
the
You're kind of
church-
hinting at it just
That's
by
right.
what you're saying.
So
but-
I'd say the role of the church is to provide a clear beacon
Yeah.
to meet people where they are, though not in judgmental ways, but in inviting ways. A priest who's a colleague of mine said once, Paul, the age of apologetics is maybe kind of over. We're not winning it by argument, even though we have very good argument. Not that we shouldn't be able to respond to people's questions. We do need that. But he said we need to create islands of healthy community. And he doesn't mean islands that separate themselves, but that maintain themselves. And so people say, there seems to be joy over there.
Yeah.
I'm going to check that out. So I think we need to keep the home fire burning bright enough that others could be attracted to it, and where we can all share the warmth of the sacramental life, our prayer life, the communal life of the church, and work on building actually loving community with each other, not just functional community with each other.
Right. Make sure that foundation's there and then
And
push
being
out from
renewed
there.
continually in our life with each other.
Amen, brother. Thank you so much for
Thank
all
you.
the insights and time. Fantastic. We'll have you on again.
Okay,
Plenty more to
great.
talk
Well,
about.
good to speak with you. This has been a 30,000-foot view
That's
of
correct.
a lot of important things.
Yeah, there's
But
a lot
glad
to
to be able
chew
to
on.
put that out there.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. And thank you for joining us on this edition of the Joyful Catholic Leaders Show. Be sure to subscribe wherever you find your podcasts and follow both the Saint Paul Seminary and St. John Vianney College Seminary on social media and at semsp.org. A reminder, new episodes drop every month on the first Friday of the month in honor of Our Lady of Fatima and the Most Sacred Heart of Jesus. Thanks for listening, and God bless.
Thanks for your work in this too, Phil. God
Thank
bless.
you. God bless you too.